Hey everyone, I'm Mick, and this is A Pile of Books. Today we're going to talk about the idea of aloneness in literature, whether it's loneliness, or depression, or fantasy, or solitude. I think that writing a book is very different than the creation of other art forms. Unlike dance, or film, or stage acting, or music, the act of writing is very solitary. The author goes away for months or years at a time and kind of creates something on their own and brings it back and into the world to try to connect us and connect themselves to the greater human experience. And I really wanted to explore the ways in which in literature we can investigate the idea of being alone, the ways in which we are alone or experience aloneness, but also the ways that literature as a form, the book as a form, can kind of showcase the idea of aloneness. So with that, I've got 4 books today that I want to take you through. Some of them are pretty lighthearted and some of them are pretty heavy. I hope that you really enjoy this. So let's go grab our first book off the shelf. The first book that we're going to talk about today is the Universal Baseball Association. This was written by Robert Coover in 1968. It is a pretty short book of a couple hundred pages about a character named J. Henry Woe. And the book itself is about the invention of fantasy baseball. Obviously, this book was written long before fantasy baseball, fantasy football, or fantasy basketball, or any fantasy sports were created. And it explores the idea of J. Henry Woe as this solitary man. He's an accountant in an unnamed city. He doesn't really get along with his coworkers. He's an outsider. He drinks too much. And he lives by himself in his house. And every day he goes back and plays a tabletop game that he invented. There in the Baseball Association are 8 teams, and within those 8 teams are individual players and full seasons. And J. Henry has created in this book an entire world for this baseball league. He rolls his dice to decide players' names. He rolls his dice to decide who's drafted to which teams. He rolls his dice to decide if a pitch is a foul ball or a home run. And he creates this world in which he lives and inhabits, and a fantasy where he is watching the lives of his baseball players play out. His favorite baseball player in the league is named Damon, and at a pretty interesting turning point in the book, Damon is hit by an errant pitch and he's killed on the field. And it creates for J. Henry this catastrophic moment in his life. Though he's sitting alone at his dining room table playing a game by himself, keeping track of the scores, he mourns the loss of his own personal favorite player in the game that he created. It becomes a turning point in his life. He decides to try to, work the fates to punish the pitcher who accidentally killed his favorite player. Jock Casey is the name of the pitcher. He invites over a coworker to try and play the game with him, kind of breaking his own rules for the fantasy baseball game. He believes that if he brings in someone from the outside world who doesn't understand how the fantasy baseball association works, that maybe he can get them to lose the game and, enact his revenge on Jock Casey, but he can't. Ultimately, the dice roll against him, even in the game that he has created all on his own. It's just a really funny book. It's lighthearted, but really profound. I always think back to the ending of this book, in which J. Henry is sitting at his table and he is celebrating the 156th season of the Universal Baseball Association. He's playing out this game on Damon's Day, which is now a holiday for and a memoriam for his favorite player. It's a really beautiful, sweet ending to this book about kind of a solitary life lived in fantasy. I hope you get a chance to read this at some point. It's very easy to pick up and read. Robert Coover is an incredible author, and I love this kind of exploration of the idea of a man's soul life in the world that he's created for himself. I've got something that's a little bit heavier for book 2, and so I'm going to head back to the book pile and pick that up now as well. There's a lot of different ways that we can explore the idea of isolation and aloneness. And in the book Malone Dies, Samuel Beckett explores not only the character and how a character experiences aloneness and depression and confinement, but also how the form of literature can explore this idea. If you're not familiar with Samuel Beckett, he was a playwright and a poet and an author. You probably know him from the play Waiting for Godot, but he wrote this incredible trilogy. In 1951, he wrote specifically the second part of that trilogy, which was called Malone Dies. Every book in this trilogy explores the idea of the empty novel, something without the recognizable objects or characters or progression that we are used to as the general format for literature. And Beckett wanted to explore the idea of entropy and the slowing down, and how can you create a novel with nothing that still interests the reader. In the story Malone Dies, we focus obviously on Malone, the character. He's a man we know nothing about besides his name, and that he is in a bed waiting to die. We don't know if he's in prison. We think maybe in an asylum or a hospital. He's waiting for his eventual end with nothing but a hat and a pencil, which is running out of graphite, in which he kind of writes and narrates stories about sordid characters who are kind of stumbling through life. And many times as he's telling us these stories, Malone is shifting from the minutia of what's happening in his room as nurses visit him, back out to these narratives that may be a part of his former life, may be him, or maybe something that he has completely fabricated. And as the book goes on, we know that Malone is reaching his end. The title of the book, Malone Dies, kind of gives us away where this is headed. And I really am interested in the way in which the prose is written, in which there is very little told to us about Malone's past, about where he is even presently, besides the fact that he is trapped and caged in this bed waiting for this end. In the end, this death that Malone is going to die is not something that he fears. It is not something that he is looking forward to. He's neither excited by the idea of an afterlife or the idea of the end of his pain. He simply is just lurching slowly towards this point in the future. It's a very, very hard read. The prose is slowly breaks down. The language itself, much like Malone's body, is mimicked. We get less and less detail and less idea as we approach the end of Malone, and the stories ramp up. They become very violent, very sordid, and truly meaningless. And we're left at the end of this book searching for meaning. All we have is this man who is alone, but does not seem to be lonely. He doesn't necessarily seem to be bitter. He might be crazy, he might be imprisoned, but we have nothing to latch on to at the end. And this is the idea of not exploring the psychology of loneliness or the psychology or of depression, but instead exploring the form in which the novel can take shape, in which it can strip away language and meaning rather than delivering us language and meaning. I really just think that typically we think of the novel as, or literature as, generally something that connects us more broadly to the outside world, something that connects us to a deeper human meaning. And Samuel Beckett's poetry does this in an incredible way, but he intentionally takes this trilogy. I think Malloy, the first in the trilogy, is probably the most famous, but I do think that Malone Dies gets to the heart of the thesis, which is, what is the slowdown? What is the breakdown? And what is entropy until we get to a point where there's no movement? no movement in a story. We have an impending end with Malone, but we don't understand what we are supposed to be looking forward to. And so we're just trapped in limbo with Malone in this bed. I hope that you get a chance to read the whole trilogy. I hope that you get a chance to read some of Beckett's poetry or plays if you haven't. But I think that as an exploration of aloneness, being you as the reader caged alongside this character who refuses to give you any consolation or any information beyond kind of his own ramblings is an incredibly interesting exercise from a literary perspective. I'm going to go ahead and grab a larger book for our number 3 on the list here. Of all the books that we're going to talk about today, this is the one that I am a little bit nervous to kind of discuss. And namely because I love the author and the story around the novel itself is a bit fraught. This is The Pale King by David Foster Wallace. This book was published in 2011 after David Foster Wallace had passed away. He left behind edits and notes on this manuscript, but he said that it was likely about 1/3 of the way done, all that was left after he passed. I'm always very, very nervous to kind of discuss a posthumous release because obviously this wasn't like The Broom of the System. This wasn't a supposedly fun thing, I'll try again. This was not obviously something like Infinite Jest. It wasn't a finished piece of work, but instead something that was kind of left behind by, I think, one of the greatest artists of his generation. The reason that we're going to talk a little bit about this book, The Pale King, focuses on many of the themes, philosophical and otherwise, that David Foster Wallace revisited throughout his life, namely the battle against distraction and the battle against entertainment, and the idea that we are constantly kind of forced by society to consume things which kind of remove us from the present moment. And oftentimes, I think especially in Infinite Jest, and maybe as well within The Girl with the Curious Hair, David Foster Wallace explores the way that depression kind of is its own vacuum, kind of sucking us into itself. But The Pale King takes a very, very different angle than all of the other books from David Foster Wallace. In Infinite Jest, which I think is his most well-known piece, David Foster Wallace sets up the idea of the entertainment, this magnetic, all-consuming piece of media, this thing that infinitely attracts, infinitely distracts. It never becomes a well that you can escape once you've been kind of caught in its vortex. And on the flip side, in The Pale King, DFW sets up the idea of boredom, the idea of the opposite of the thing that sucks you away and isolates you. The novel focuses on Claude, and Claude Silvenshine is an IRS worker who moves to Illinois to do tax work. And the book is 500 plus pages long, and hundreds of pages are devoted to the minutia of tax law and the minutia of the handwriting and activity that a character in the 90s would have to do as a worker for the IRS. The book itself is boring. Its intention is to bore you, and the subject matter that it focuses on is the idea of boredom, the idea of forcing yourself to focus on something, to avoid the distraction, to avoid the other things that consume you, and instead to force yourself into this position where you are sitting with only yourself, and in this case only with yourself and your work as kind of being the main idea behind it. I really like the idea of the banality of boredom, but also the banality of depression. This book tackles both subjects the way that DFW tackled depression from his personal side, and obviously within his literature and his artwork as well. I like the idea that this book is about a life built around boredom and what boredom unlocks for us. And in many ways, what is being stolen away from us as boredom is being pushed to the very edges of our experience as a human being. In many ways, I think the entertainment and many of the kind of speeches that DFW gave around modern culture in the 90s was about the dangers of distraction and the dangers of constant consumption. And I really love the idea that in the end, the final words that David Foster Wallace left with us were the idea that we could find meaning and purpose by sitting alone, free from distraction, being focused only solely on a thing that does the opposite of everything else in the world that is trying to tear away our attention. The idea that boredom and sitting with yourself can be a positive way to live your life, I think is a really beautiful message for David Foster Wallace to have left with us, and I really wanted to include it here in our exploration of aloneness. With that, I'm going to talk about our fourth book in this video. I'm really excited to talk about this as kind of the final book. This is Too Loud a Solitude by Bohumil Baral. He was a Czech writer and he wrote this in 1976. I love Czech writers and I think that Baral is one of the lesser appreciated ones. The story of this book revolves around Hanta, a man who lives in Prague and works at a paper crushing factory. Books and magazines and newspapers of all kinds are brought to his factory, and he brings them through the process of being shredded and being churned up and turned into kind of a mulch for new paper to be created. Hanta lives his life alone. He lives a life in which he, in the 100 pages of the book, struggles through his trauma of his past, the loss of his love, but the book itself is a meditation on the beauty of solitude and aloneness. It is a book about the love of books. Hanta rescues his favorite copies from his authors that he loves from the clutches of his own machine. He talks about passages from literature that he loves. He has imaginary conversations with his favorite authors. This, if you love movies about movies, books about books, this is the pinnacle of kind of reverence for the written word. The book is about the peace that you can have being alone, especially when you surround yourself with a life of art. And while we've talked in this video quite a bit about aloneness that leads to depression or aloneness that leads you to isolation, here we learn more about aloneness that leads to a peace and a solitude. Hanta in the book has this incredible quote that says, "I can be by myself, but I'm never lonely. I'm simply alone, living in my heavily populated solitude, a harum-scarum of infinity and eternity, and infinity and eternity seem to take a liking to the likes of me." He struggles throughout the book with the loss of the gypsy girl who was his love. The book is set against the backdrop of Prague post-World War II. The woman that he is trying to remember her name throughout the entire book passed away in World War II in a concentration camp. His uncle, who he looks up to, also passed away. And much of the book is about him struggling with the trauma of the past and the fact that he has a hard time adjusting this post-war world. I really hope that you get a chance to dive into the 92 pages that make up one of the most beautiful pieces of literature and one of the greatest meditations on solitude that I've ever read. Before we end this video, I just want to talk a little bit more about the idea of the solitary life, aloneness, and loneliness, but also kind of the peace that comes with solitude. I think that it's impossible to really discuss this in all of literature. It's been explored so thoroughly from the actual perspectives of characters that feel alone, think Crime and Punishment and the kind of anguish that the characters go through. It's also obviously been explored in form, some of the form that we talked about here with something like Beckett, but in a lot of different forms of novella and poetry. I just wanted to pull out and kind of investigate different ways in which we can think about the idea of aloneness in literature, and hopefully inspire you to read some things that show that just because you're alone, you don't have to be lonely. Thank you again for watching this video. I'm Nick, and this is A Pile of Books. Hope to see you again.